there everyone, this is Dr. Shweta. Welcome to the first module of my course on CUET PG English entrance exam. From this video onwards, I would straight away dive into the history of English literature. So when we start preparing for the history of English literature, the very first age or the very first division that we come across is the Anglo-Saxon period. But it is also important for us to know a little bit about the period before the Anglo-Saxon period. What was that period like? What happened before Anglo-Saxons came? So what was the time period before the Anglo-Saxon period called? That was the time which was popularly known as classical period today. And it is necessary for us as literature students to know a little bit about this time period as well, so that we can form a stable ground for ourselves while we proceed towards the later periods of the English literary history. The classical period began from 8th century BC and it lasted up to 5th century AD. That is for almost 14 or 1500 years, which means this period started in BC, that is before the birth of Christ, and it is believed that Christ was born somewhere between 6th century BC to 4th century BC. It also means therefore that Christianity as a religion did not exist before 6th century BC. Just have a look at the timeline to better understand this. So coming back to the classical period, what kind of writers or what type of literature was being produced during the classical period? Let's get to know that. We divide classical period into three phases or three sub-periods: the archaic period, the Hellenistic period, and the Roman period, or as we call it, the Roman Empire. Now let us know about the major poets and popular literature during these three phases of the Greco-Roman period. In the first period of the classical era, that is the archaic period, the most famous and well-known poet that emerged was Homer. Homer was a poet and he is known to have written two of the most popular classical epic narratives, Iliad and Odyssey. Both the Iliad and the Odyssey were written around 8th century BC by the blind poet Homer. The two texts belong to the archaic period of the Greco-Roman age. If we talk about the chronology, then Odyssey narrates the events which happened after the Trojan War. So we can say that Odyssey is the sequel to Iliad. So Iliad happened first and then he wrote Odyssey. The Iliad and Odyssey are in the genre of epic narratives. That is, they are long narrative poems that talk about the larger than life characters in heroic style, written in poetic verse, just like our grand epic narratives Ramayana and Mahabharata. Now let us talk about the Iliad first. The central character or hero of the Iliad is Achilles, a Greek warrior who fights for the army of Sparta, led by Agamemnon, the leader. The Spartans are fighting against the Trojan army, who is led by Hector, a Trojan prince. We see gods taking sides with their choice of human warriors in this epic and supporting their favored characters. So just like Mahabharata and Ramayana, we see gods and humans coming together in these Western epics and trying hard to get their favored party win the battle. The reason for the war between two sides is because of Helen, the Spartan queen and wife of Agamemnon, who has in the past fallen in love with Paris, a Trojan prince and younger brother to Hector, and she is now living with him in Troy. So Agamemnon, with the help of Achilles, fights with the Trojans to bring his wife and his honor back to his state, Sparta. The Spartans finally win and take Helen back, but in the process, Hector gets killed by Achilles. The epic does not talk about the death of Achilles, but it is known that after he kills Hector in the battle, Achilles is also killed by Paris, the Trojan prince. Now let's come to the second epic narrative, Odyssey. Rather than starting where the Iliad left off, the Odyssey begins 10 years after the war has ended. The central character of Odyssey is Odysseus or Ulysses. Odysseus 10 years back fought in the war from the side of the Spartans in the previous text, the Iliad. He has acted as a close confidant and a good friend of Achilles. After the war is over, Odysseus plans to go back to his state, Ithaca. His son Telemachus and his wife Penelope are waiting for him over there and are ruling his state in his absence. But it has been almost 10 years now that Odysseus has not returned. This worries the mother and son, and the son leaves Ithaca in search of his long lost father. The story has many challenges that Odysseus faced during his journey back to his state after the war of Troy is over, and all these hardships and challenges that he faces on his way back forms the entire plot of this great epic narrative. Again, we see certain gods siding with Odysseus and some against him, which elongates his journey back to his state. But finally, at the end, Odysseus returns back to his homeland and meets his son as well as his wife after a period of 10 long years. Now let's discuss the major themes of the Iliad and the Odyssey. The major themes of the Iliad and the Odyssey are vengeance, heroism, immortality, homecoming, will of the gods, and the most important one is hubris, that is pride of the central character. The central characters are very prideful. That leads to their downfall. Other important writers that were popular from this period are Aeschylus. Aeschylus is also known as the father of tragedy. He was the very first writer who started writing tragedies and who inspired many English writers later on. His most popular tragedy is Oresteia, a trilogy of 3 parts. So earlier it was a trend to write a tragedy in 3 parts. Second, we have Sophocles, who was another tragedy writer from this period, and he is famously known to have written the Theban trilogy Oedipus Rex, which talks about 3 plays based on the life of Oedipus, a mythical character. The names of 3 plays in this trilogy are Oedipus Tyrannus, Oedipus at Colonus, and last is Antigone. The third important tragedy writer from the Greek period was Euripides. He famously wrote a tragedy named Medea based on the revenge of the titular character Medea, who seeks revenge upon her husband by killing her children. We also have thinkers and philosophers from this period like Socrates, who wrote his philosophical ideas under the title called Dialogues or Socrates' Dialogues. His ideas later on inspired his student Plato. Moving on to next division of the Greco-Roman period. The next division that comes after the Archaic period is the Hellenistic period. Hellenistic era is nothing but an extension to the classical Greek period. By extension, I mean that growth and development of the Greek culture, Greek society, Greek religion, Greek literature, and everything that the Greeks gave to the world. So we can say that the term Hellenistic literally means to imitate Greeks. It was the time dominated majorly by the fusion of Greek language and customs with the culture of the Near East. The actual era of Hellenistic period started with the life and later the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE and ended when the Romans conquered Greece in 161 BC, that is 2nd century BC. And then Greece remained a part of the Roman Empire until the late 4th century AD. A few key literary features of the Hellenistic period were the comedies by Aristophanes, who wrote comedies like The Clouds, The Wasps, Lysistrata, and The Frogs. We have another comedy writer like Menander, who was also writing comedies at the time, and poets like Pindar, who were popular for writing odes, namely the victory odes. Pindar's odes later on inspired the 17th century poet Abraham Colley to develop a new form of odes based on Pindaric odes. There were also historians like Thucydides who recorded Greek history at that time. Then there were philosophers like Plato and Aristotle who were interested in philosophical aspects of life as a citizen of Greece at that time. Plato is well known to have written The Republic, a philosophical treatise on the affairs of the Greek governing system. Aristotle was the student of Plato and later became the tutor of Alexander the Great. Aristotle is famous for his work Poetics. Moving on to the last division of the Greco-Roman period, which is the Roman Empire. The Roman era in Greece started with the Rome taking over Greece in 2nd century BC. Rome saw 2 most prominent rulers, Julius Caesar and later on Augustus Caesar. The important literary figures from the Roman period were Virgil, Horace, Ovid, Seneca, Plautus and Terence. Now let us discuss them a little. Virgil was a poet who popularly wrote the Aeneid, which was modeled after Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. It is also an epic narrative like those two, and it talks about the Romans as heroes. The central character of the Aeneid is the mythical hero Aeneas, who fought during the Trojan War as described in the Iliad by Homer. Next, we have Horace, who wrote in various genres like the odes, satires, and epistles. Epistles means to write via letters, to write through letters. One of his epistles, Ars Poetica, is popular in the literary theory. Then we have Ovid, who mostly wrote love poems. His famous work of poetry is Metamorphoses, which is the greatest source of mythology for the Renaissance writers. Lastly, we have the playwrights from the Roman period, Seneca, who was popular for his tragedies and who later inspired writers like Webster and Shakespeare to write their tragedies. And then we have comedy writers like Plautus and Terence, both of whom popularized the comedies of the modern English world in periods to come later. So with this, I end the brief about the period before the Anglo-Saxon period, though you won't expect much questions from the classical age, but a few here and there may come to you in exam, and it is always better to be prepared than to have known nothing at all. Lastly, please attempt the quiz given at the end of this section so as to remember most of the points in question forms. This really will help you in the actual exam. See you next in another video, the Anglo-Saxon period, or as we call it, the medieval period.